I still remember the way my hands were shaking when I opened that workshop door. Not from the cold, not from age, from something I can only describe as the ground shifting beneath everything I thought I knew about my own family. But let me start from the beginning, because if I just told you what I found that morning, you wouldn't feel the weight of it, and you need to feel the weight of it to understand why I did what I did next. Before I get into this, if you've ever had a moment where a stranger said something so small, so quiet, that it ended up changing the entire course of your life, then this story is for you. I'd love for you to stick around to the end, because I promise you, this is one of those stories that will sit with you long after it's over. If you're new here, consider subscribing. I share real stories, real moments, and sometimes real lessons that nobody asks for, but everybody needs. And while you're here, drop a comment. Tell me where in the world you're watching from right now, and tell me, what would you have done? Would you have listened to that old woman? Or would you have swept the floor and gone to bed? I genuinely want to know. Now, let me take you back. My name is not important. What's important is that I'm 63 years old, recently retired from 31 years of working in municipal water management, and that I have a workshop in the back of my property that I have been building things in since I was 27 years old. That workshop is not just a room. I want you to understand that before we go any further. My father helped me pour the concrete slab for that floor. He was 62 at the time, almost exactly the age I am now, and he couldn't bend his knees the way he used to, so he worked from a low stool, mixing and smoothing with his hands. He passed 4 years later. Whenever I walk across that floor, I think about his hands. I think about the way he hummed without realizing he was doing it. Old country songs he'd never name if you asked him. I've built furniture in that workshop. I've repaired broken things. I've made toys for my grandchildren before they were old enough to ask for anything. I've sat in there alone on nights when the grief was too heavy for the house. I've had a beer on that concrete floor and talked to my father like he was sitting across from me. That place is not just a workshop, it's the one place in my life that has always been completely, honestly mine. My daughter Clara married Marcus 7 years ago. I want to be careful here because Clara is my daughter and I love her. And this story is not about making her look foolish. But I also want to be honest, because if I soften too many edges, the story stops being true. Marcus is a charming man. That's the first thing anyone will tell you about him. He walks into a room and people turn toward him like sunflowers toward light. He laughs at the right moments. He remembers names. He shakes your hand with both of his, and it makes you feel for just a second like you're the most important person he's spoken to all week. I noticed the charm immediately, and I didn't distrust it, not at first. Some people are just like that. Warm, easy. Clara was happy, and that mattered more to me than anything else. But over the years, certain things settled in me like sediment in a glass of water. You don't notice it while it's settling. You only see it when the water goes still. Marcus had opinions about the workshop. That was the first thing that started the settling. Nothing aggressive. Nothing you could point to and say, there. That was the moment. It was more like suggestions. He'd come back from the hardware store in town and mention, casually, that the property value of homes in our area had jumped. And wasn't it a shame that the workshop took up such usable square footage? He said it the way people say things they've already decided, but haven't announced yet. Like he was doing preliminary work, testing the soil. I'd nod, I'd say something vague, and then I'd go back to whatever I was building, and I'd try not to think about it too hard. He asked me once, over dinner, whether I'd ever thought about converting the workshop into a rental unit. He had a friend who'd done it, he said, made an extra $1,800 a month. Easy money, he said, and Clara smiled the way she sometimes smiles when she's not sure if she should and decides to anyway. I told him no. I said it kindly. I said it once. He nodded and changed the subject, and I thought that was the end of it. That was not the end of it. The day I met the woman at the hardware store was a Tuesday in late October. I remember because the leaves had turned completely, and the sky that morning was the color of old pewter. The kind of sky that presses down on you gently, the way a hand might rest on your shoulder. I'd driven into town to pick up a box of finish nails. Small ones, 18 gauge, for a corner cabinet I was building as a Christmas gift for my youngest granddaughter. She'd seen one like it in a magazine and cut out the picture and handed it to me without saying a word. Just handed it to me and walked away. That's how our family expresses love sometimes. In handoffs. The hardware store in our town is not a big chain. It's the kind of place where the floors creak and the owner's dog sleeps by the register, and they still have a handwritten sign above the key duplicating machine that says back in 10 minutes, even when the man is standing right there. I love that store. I have spent more hours there than I can count. There was a line at the register, 3 people ahead of me, and at the very front of the line was a woman who I guessed to be somewhere around 80 years old, small, dressed in a dark coat that was clean but clearly old, with a collar that had been turned and resewn. She had a basket with a few things in it, some weather stripping, a package of picture-hanging hooks, and a small box of nails, the same 18-gauge finish nails I was holding. She was counting coins. Now, I want to say something about this, because I don't tell it to sound noble. I'm not telling you I swooped in like some hero. I tell you what happened because it matters for what comes after. She was counting coins, slowly, with fingers that didn't bend easily anymore, and she came up short. I heard her tell the young man at the register that she'd have to put back the nails. She said it without embarrassment, but without ease either. The way people say things they've had to learn to say over a long life. I stepped forward and put the difference on the counter. $4 and change. It wasn't a gesture. It was just the obvious thing. She turned and looked at me. I want you to understand the way she looked at me. Not with surprise, not with gratitude exactly. She looked at me the way someone looks at a person they've been expecting. Like I was slightly late to something but had arrived. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was low and clear, like water at the bottom of a well. I nodded. I told her it was nothing. I started to turn back to my place in line. That's when she touched my arm. Her grip was surprisingly firm, not aggressive, but deliberate. The kind of grip that says, I need you to be still for a moment. And something in me went still. She leaned in slightly, and she said in that same low, clear voice, "After your son-in-law leaves, don't sweep the sawdust." I stood there. I didn't say anything for a long moment. I was trying to find the entry point into what she'd just said, trying to locate where to grab hold of it. I asked her what she meant. She was already putting her basket on the counter. She didn't look back at me. She just said, "You'll know when the time comes." And then she paid, gathered her bag, and walked out the door. I watched through the front window as she got into an old car, dark blue, and pulled away slowly. The young man at the register was looking at me. "Do you know her?" I asked. He shook his head. "Never seen her before." I drove home thinking about almost nothing else. I tried to apply logic to it. Maybe she'd overheard something in the store. Maybe she'd mistaken me for someone else. Maybe she was simply a woman of advanced years who sometimes said unexpected things, and I was a man who needed to let it go. But I couldn't. There was something about the precision of it. Not your family, not your house, your son-in-law, and not just any room. The workshop, the sawdust. How could she have known those things? I went over it again and again, the way you work at a knot in a piece of rope, turning it, trying different angles, finding no give. That evening, Marcus came over for dinner. He and Clara and their 2 boys. The younger one fell asleep on the couch before dessert, and the older one helped me clear the table, which he'd started doing recently, unprompted, and which made me feel something big and wordless in my chest every time. Marcus was his usual self, engaged, funny. He talked about a new project at work and a documentary he'd been watching, and he asked me how the corner cabinet was coming along. I told him well. I told him I just picked up the finish nails. He nodded. Then, after a beat, he said, "You know, I was looking at some plans the other day for the property. Nothing serious, just something I put together for Clara to look at. But I thought, maybe we could find a time to sit down, the 3 of us, and talk through some ideas." Clara glanced at me. Something moved in her face quickly and then settled. "Sure," I said, "sometime." That night after they left, I stood at the kitchen window and looked out toward the workshop. The light above the door was on, the way I always leave it, a small yellow square in the dark. I thought about the woman's voice, the grip of her hand. Don't sweep the sawdust. The next morning was quiet. I woke early, the way I always do, made coffee, stood in the kitchen in the gray pre-dawn light, and listened to the house breathe around me. Marcus had been in the workshop a few days before, helping me move some lumber. I hadn't thought much of it at the time. He'd offered, I'd said yes, we'd move the boards to the sidewall, and he'd left without going through any of my things. Or so I'd assumed. I set down my coffee cup. I walked to the back door, put on my jacket and my boots. The grass was stiff with cold. I crossed the yard slowly. I don't know what I was expecting. Part of me was still telling myself I was being foolish, that I was a 63-year-old man chasing the words of a stranger in a hardware store, and I should be embarrassed. But there is a voice that lives deeper than logic, older than embarrassment, and that voice had been speaking clearly since Tuesday. I stood at the workshop door. I put my hand on the handle. The smell of the place reached me before I was even inside. Wood shavings and machine oil, and something faintly like cold earth, which is always there in the corners where the concrete hasn't fully dried since last winter. My father's concrete. I breathed it in. I pushed the door open. The light came on. The same light it's always been. A bare bulb on a pull chain that I keep meaning to replace with something better. I stood in the doorway and I looked at the floor. The sawdust was there, right where I'd left it after a long session 2 days ago, working on the cabinet sides. A soft scatter of pale wood dust across the left side of the floor, near the workbench, undisturbed. I'd been about to sweep it that evening before I got distracted by a phone call. I'd thought about sweeping it again after dinner, and then I'd remembered her words, and I hadn't. I walked inside. I walked to the workbench. I looked at the sawdust, and then I crouched down. You know how dust settles differently on something that's sitting on the floor compared to a floor that's empty? There's a faint outline, a shadow, a place where the settling isn't quite even. There was something under the sawdust, near the base of the back wall, where I keep a loose board I use to level uneven projects. I moved the sawdust carefully with my hand. The board was slightly off-center, not enough to notice unless you were already looking. I lifted it. Underneath, in a space I hadn't touched since I'd laid that piece of wood years ago, there was a small digital camera, a memory card, a folded piece of paper. I sat down on the workshop floor, right there on the cold concrete my father had poured with his own stiff hands, and I didn't move for a long time. I want to be careful about how I describe what came next, not for legal reasons, but because I have a daughter I love, and I have grandchildren who love their father, and the truth when it came out was both worse and more complicated than I'd imagined. The camera had photos on it, photos of my workshop, every corner, every storage space, the inside of the cabinet where I keep my father's old tools, the locked box on the top shelf, which holds the original deed to the property, the title to my truck, and a small envelope of cash I keep for emergencies. The lock on the box had been photographed from 3 different angles. The folded paper had notes on it, measurements, assessed values, what the square footage could yield if the structure were converted or demolished. There was a name and phone number written at the bottom. A developer, I later learned. Marcus had been building something, not with wood, not with his hands. He'd been building a case. Quietly, patiently, the way charming people build things, while everyone around them is still looking at the smile. I didn't rage. I want to tell you that clearly because I think part of you is expecting me to. I made another cup of coffee. I sat with what I knew. I thought about my daughter and what she did and didn't understand. I thought about my grandchildren, the older one who clears the table without being asked, and the younger one who sleeps on the couch before dessert. I thought about what justice looks like when it has to live inside a family. When Marcus came by that afternoon, I'd called and asked him to come, Told him I wanted to talk about those property ideas he'd mentioned. He arrived with his easy walk and his warm handshake. I made him coffee. We sat at the kitchen table. I slid the folded paper across the table. I watched his face. I won't describe exactly what moved through his expression in the 3 seconds before he composed himself. But I'll say this, for just a moment, before the charm reassembled itself, I saw the architecture underneath it. And it was not warm. It was not easy. It was something calculated and afraid. "This is just preliminary research," he said. "I was going to talk to you about it." "With a camera," I said, "in my workshop." Clara came to me that evening, after Marcus had gone home to think, she said. She was upset. She felt pulled. She sat at my kitchen table and cried in a way that broke something in me and something else in me at the same time. I told her I wasn't asking her to choose. I told her the truth was just the truth, and we had to decide together what to do with it. I told her I loved her. I told her I was not angry, not in the way she was afraid of. But I also told her that no decision about this property, any part of it, including the workshop, would ever be made by anyone other than me, while I'm living. And after I'm gone, my will, which I had quietly updated that same week, would say everything that needed to be said. Some people in my family took Marcus's side, at least at first, said I was paranoid, said he had a right to think about the family's future, said I was holding on to a building like it was more important than people. Maybe that's what makes this story hard to settle with, because maybe they weren't entirely wrong. I do hold on to that workshop like it matters more than it should. I hold on to it because it's the floor my father touched, because it's the place where I've been most honestly myself for 30-some years. Because some things are not assets. Some things are just where you put your heart down when you need to. Marcus and Clara are still married. It's been months now. Things are different, not broken, but different. The way a piece of wood is different after it's been sanded down to find the grain. Still the same piece, but you can see more of what it actually is. I go to the workshop most mornings still. I finished the corner cabinet. My granddaughter has it in her room now. I heard she put her most important things in it: a letter, some drawings, a small stuffed bear she's had since she was 2. She gave me a piece of paper with a drawing of me on it, standing in front of a building with a yellow light. I keep it on the workbench. Some days I sweep the sawdust. Some days I leave it. Because sometimes the things we almost overlook are the most important things of all. And sometimes the strangest messengers are the ones who see us most clearly. I still don't know who that woman was. I drove back to the hardware store the following week and asked again. Nobody had seen her. No dark blue car remembered. But I think about her grip, the firmness of it, the certainty. And I understand that some gifts come without explanation. You just have to be still enough to receive them. If this story stayed with you, if you found yourself leaning in somewhere in the middle of it, then you already know what to do. Leave a like, subscribe if you haven't yet, and leave me a comment. I read every single one. Tell me what you thought of Marcus. Tell me what you would have done. Tell me if you have a place like that workshop, somewhere that belongs to you in a way that goes beyond deed and title. I'd love to hear about it.